Welcome to Reinventing Parking, the podcast about parking policy for anyone who wants a better city and better urban transport. Welcome back. I'm your host, Paul Barter. I want to talk about parking in Singapore, which is where I live. Before I start, a quick reminder that Reinventing Parking is also the official podcast of the Parking Reform Network. And there's been a lot of really encouraging news from PRN in the last month or two. So please do visit parkingreform.org and follow PRN on social media to catch up. Now, on to Singapore. Singapore is weird. Is its parking weird too? And is Singapore a parking reform model to copy? Singapore is famous for some unusual policy choices. I've lived in Singapore for 22 years now, so I'm used to its weirdness, but it really is an unusual place. Even just being a city-state is unusual, of course. And Singapore also has an unusual approach to a wide range of policy areas. About 40% of the water we drink here is recycled water, and a lot of urban land is actually part of the catchment area for drinking water. Famously, you can't buy chewing gum here. Pornography is totally illegal, but prostitution in certain places is legal. The main languages spoken by most Singaporeans changed drastically over just 2 generations. When the government tightens monetary policy here, it adjusts the currency exchange rate, not interest rates. Public housing, known as HDB, houses an astonishing 79% of the resident households. And turning to transport, Singapore famously pioneered congestion pricing since the mid-1970s. And buying a car has been made very expensive. Right now, in late 2022, even the cheapest new cars in Singapore cost more than $90,000. This is a rich city, but only about 1/3 of households own a car. Singapore is weird, but it is also successful in many ways, so cities in middle-income countries have often been keen to learn from Singapore. But what about parking? What is unusual or interesting about Singapore's approach to parking? Is Singapore a pioneer or innovator on parking? Should other cities be trying to learn from Singapore parking? Well, at first glance, the answer is no. Parking and parking policies in Singapore look rather conventional. However, the longer story is more interesting, with various quirky parking practices and a few policies worth emulating. I'm going to take a rather breezy and informal look at parking in Singapore today. It's a podcast episode after all, and I don't want to bore you all. But if you really do want more of the gory details, you can look up a chapter I wrote about Singapore parking. It's in the 2020 book, Parking, an International Perspective, edited by a team led by Dorina Porjani. Before I dive into the Singapore parking details, here are some teasers for some of the puzzles we will look at. Singapore has parking mandates, despite its successful decades-long effort to become a transit-oriented metropolis. It's a little odd. Having parking mandates seems to go against every other transport policy in Singapore. But an encouraging overarching theme is that parking policy in Singapore is gradually being made more consistent with the city-state's transit-oriented and car-light policy priorities. Here is another puzzle. Like most parking mandates, Singapore's are based on the idea that every new building should meet its own parking demand within its own site. But in practice, most neighbourhoods in Singapore have ended up as park once and walk areas where much parking is open to the public. It's also a little surprising that, despite those parking mandates, parking fees are much more ubiquitous in Singapore than in most cities around the world. In most other cities I have visited, motorists occasionally pay for parking at their destinations, but more commonly park free of charge. In Singapore, motorists pay for parking at most of their destinations and park free of charge only at some. Are there any park and ride fans out there? Singapore launched a park and ride program in 1993, but it was recently abolished. I'll get to that story near the end of the episode. Okay, let's look at some details. starting with parking in the streets. Singapore has only about 14,500 explicitly marked on-street car parking spaces, which is not very many in a city of almost 6 million people and almost 700,000 cars. There is a bit more street parking in areas with single-family housing, where the parking is not marked out and is not managed, but not very much more. So that's one unusual thing. Parking in streets is almost always a small proportion of total parking, but in Singapore, it's an even smaller proportion than usual. The lack of parking meters might also surprise many visitors, especially visitors from Western countries. Even though Singapore has had paid on-street parking since 1965, there have never been any parking meters here. Initially, uniformed attendants collected fees and issued receipts. But rising labour costs prompted a change in the 1980s. The government considered parking meters, but changed its mind after a study tour to Israel, which suggested that pre-purchased paper coupons would be just as good and much cheaper to implement. To pay with coupons, motorists grab their pre-purchased stack of coupons, then select coupons with enough value for their stay, then tear off chads to indicate the correct date and time, and then display the coupons on the vehicle dashboard. That might sound like a lot, but it's just like displaying tickets from a pay and display machine, except it's do-it-yourself. Motorists can still use coupons if they want to, but the coupon system is gradually being phased out. Most motorists now pay with the parking.sg mobile app. This has various advantages, both for the motorists and for the government. So Singapore actually looks like it may soon join the club of cities where street parking payments are via mobile payments alone, with no parking meters and almost no in-street infrastructure. There are other examples around the world, such as Tel Aviv, Shenzhen, Penang, and Sao Paulo. These are all cities that skipped parking meters altogether, like Singapore. Singapore's street parking rates themselves are not unusual, nor are they any kind of international best practice. There is very little variation in the street parking fees from place to place, and it's usually many years between fee adjustments. There's no sign yet of demand-responsive price setting for parking in Singapore. On-street parking costs 60 Singapore cents for half an hour, except in the central area in the daytime, where it is $1.20 per half hour. 1 Singapore dollar is currently worth about 73 US cents. One result of this lack of price variation is that certain areas have full on-street parking at busy times, with the usual results such as illegal parking, circling, and double parking. It may come as a surprise, given Singapore's reputation for order and excellent management of most things, that we do have some parking chaos here and there. Singapore is mostly a high-rise city, but ironically, some of the most serious parking conflicts are in the low-rise private residential areas, especially those with row houses and those located near commercial areas. There is little or no official management of the on-street parking in these single-family housing areas, where only about 5% of Singapore households actually live. Residents often try to reserve parking in front of their homes using pot plants and rubbish bins. Despite the conflicts, the affluent residents of these areas usually oppose the imposition of formal parking management, which is always an option, since marking out the spaces would reduce the parking capacity and would require them to pay for permits, which are called season parking here. By the way, Singapore never uses on-street parking time limits, which is probably a good thing. Parking management here always involves fees. I won't say much about parking enforcement. It's reasonably efficient, at least in the managed parking areas. One nice enforcement innovation since 2015 that Professor Donald Shoup would approve of is tiered fines, so that a second offence within 12 months now attracts a higher tier of parking fines. Now let's talk about Singapore's parking mandates. The city-state still has minimum parking requirements. Parking reformers like me prefer to call them parking mandates. As I mentioned earlier, it's something of a surprise that Singapore, which is famous for promoting mass transit and limiting car use, is not in the vanguard of cities that are abolishing their parking mandates. It still requires parking to be provided on site with new buildings. What's going on? Singapore adopted parking minimums in the 1960s, which was a time of rapid car ownership growth. Those old parking mandates were much lower than suburban North American standards. For example, 1 parking space for every 200 square metres of office floor space, or thereabouts. But they were applied everywhere, including the central area and in what later became MRT station vicinities. Car ownership in the late 1960s was less than 70 cars per 1,000 people. But Singapore's transport policies changed in the early and mid-1970s. So by the late 1970s, the parking mandates clearly contradicted the government's new efforts to limit traffic to and from the central area and to limit car ownership. In the 1980s, realising this problem, the government tried to remedy the contradiction without getting rid of the mandates. It brought in a CBD parking levy imposed on owners of each non-residential parking space in the city centre. It was intended to increase the cost of parking for motorists, but in fact, many parking owners responded by closing parts of their parking facilities. This was unintended apparently, but it made it clear that the levy and the parking mandates contradicted each other, not to mention other transport policies, and that there was a problem with the parking mandates. So in 1990, a more useful action was taken. The parking standards for non-residential land uses in the central area and near rail were lowered by about 50%. And in 2002, city centre parking mandates were lowered again. Meanwhile, outside the city centre and rail station zones, the mandates mostly stayed about the same. Things have changed again quite recently, with bigger reforms to the parking standards in February 2019. These have continued the main themes from the earlier reforms. For example, the government again lowered the parking mandates in the city centre and near rail. Some are now half of the old ones. But the 2019 changes included some new things too. For the first time, Singapore now has parking maximums, which it calls the upper bound parking provision standards. The minimums are called the lower bound. These new maximums are not very restrictive in the sense that they are about the same or just 20% lower than the old minimums, depending on location and land use. Here are some examples of the parking standards in Singapore that have resulted from these 2019 reforms. London's famous office building known as the Gherkin wasn't required to have any parking in London. If the same building with its 41 stories and 48,000 square metres of floor space were built today in Singapore's city centre, it would need at least 53 parking spaces and would be allowed a maximum of 89 parking spaces. An office building in the city centre or close to a rail station must now provide between 1 space per 900 square metres and 1 space per 540 square metres of floor space. For private residential condominiums or apartments in the city centre or near rail stations, the minimum is 0.5 spaces per residential unit and the maximum is 0.8 spaces per unit. Everywhere else, these residential land uses must provide between 0.8 and 1 parking space per residential unit. These kinds of private sector housing typically have affluent residents. Working class and middle class people are generally in public housing. Another significant change in February 2019 was the introduction of an entirely new approach to planning parking for certain areas which will be designated as car light precincts. There are 4 soon-to-be-developed areas in Singapore that have been gazetted as car light precincts. In these zones, the Land Transport Authority can now determine the parking provision on a case-by-case basis. The idea, if I understand correctly, is to enable shared or public parking without requiring parking on every site. So it will be very interesting to watch as these 4 areas are planned as Park Once and Walk districts. The February 2019 reforms also introduced new requirements to provide both motorcycle and bicycle parking in new developments. None of these changes is especially surprising. Many cities have reduced their city centre parking mandates in similar, cautious ways like Singapore. I would have liked to see a bolder reform, abolish the parking mandates. But reducing parking mandates is certainly better than increasing them. However, here is something that is surprising about Singapore's parking provision standards. Even before the new maximums, developers of offices and retail treated Singapore's minimums as if they were maximums. When the government lowered the city centre parking mandates in 2002, for example, various developers complained about this new restriction on parking. But wait a minute, they were minimums. Developers could still provide more parking than the standards if they wished. So why were they talking as if there were parking maximums and they had been made more restrictive? Well, the answer lies in an esoteric detail about whether parking counts as floor area. It's something we actually should be paying more attention to. For Singapore offices, malls, hotels, among others, only parking space up to the relevant parking provision standard was exempt from counting towards the gross floor area allowed under the master plan. In other words, if a developer provided more parking over and above the parking mandate, then that parking did count towards the floor area calculation. So any such extra parking had a much higher opportunity cost than the required parking. Building such parking would force the developers to build less leasable commercial floor space. This made Singapore's parking minimums feel like maximums to the developers. Okay, enough about parking mandates. Let's look at how motorists pay for off-street parking in Singapore. The interesting thing here is that paying for most off-street parking in Singapore has been very frictionless and easy for much longer than in most other parts of the world. Because of the electronic road pricing system, all Singapore registered vehicles have a device on the dashboard, just inside their windscreen, that uses microwave signals to talk with the pricing gantries and deduct the right amount from the motorist's bank account or from a contactless card inserted into the device. And since the early 1990s, more and more of Singapore's off-street parking has adopted the same system for deducting parking payments. So Singapore motorists almost never have to wind down their window to pay for parking as they exit a parking facility. Parking in Singapore's public housing areas, or HDB towns, also has some surprising and interesting quirks that are worth a minute or two of your time. HDB has its own guidelines on how much parking to build, but it does not make them public, unfortunately. But we do know that HDB has a huge stock of parking. When I checked in 2016 for that book chapter, HDB owned and managed almost 616,000 car parking spaces. That was more than the total number of cars in the country that year. There were also almost 164,000 motorcycle parking spaces. But one good thing about parking in HDB housing is that it is unbundled from the housing. All HDB residents who own motor vehicles have, for decades now, had to pay for season permits to park their cars. This costs at least 80 Singapore dollars, or at least $58 per month, or almost $700 per year. Quite a hefty fee. Another good feature of HDB parking is that most of it is open to the public. Spaces that are open to all are marked with white lines. Spaces for season permit holders, most of whom are residents, are marked with red lines. These red spaces are for any vehicle with a permit for that neighbourhood. There are no individually reserved slots. A third category is spaces that are public most of the time, but which are season parking only at night and on Sundays. These are marked with dashed red and white lines. An important result of this open to the public feature is that places in and around HDB estates are all park once and walk areas. I've mentioned that concept a few times now. You might want to look it up at the Reinventing Parking website if the idea of park once and walk doesn't mean anything to you. In addition to all the HDB parking mentioned before, some areas in Singapore have some other public parking owned and run by the Planning Authority, the Urban Redevelopment Authority, or URA. But the numbers are small only about 17,000 off-street parking spaces altogether. Most of this is surface parking on vacant state land in locations that were deemed to be short of parking. They are supposedly temporary, although some of them have been in place for decades. About 16% of Singapore households live in condominium-style apartments. What's parking like in these complexes? Well, by contrast with HDB, these are almost never open to the public. Visitors can park, but need to register with the guards at the gate. And unlike HDB, Singapore's private multifamily housing developments generally do bundle parking permits with housing unit costs. However, some developments at least seek extra payments for the second and subsequent cars of multi-car households. Something that is a little unusual about Singapore's condominium parking is that the on-site parking is legally part of the common property of each complex. So condominium parking spaces in Singapore cannot be individually leased or bought and sold as they can in some countries. So we never read headlines about sky-high parking retail prices in Singapore, like we do in Hong Kong, for example. Let's look at Singapore workplace parking. What's interesting about that? A large proportion of employee parking at workplaces is priced. In fact, my guess is that well over half of motorists who drive to work in Singapore pay for their parking. This is almost always paid on a long-term season parking basis with no discounts for days not used. So once they have the permit, they have an incentive to drive every day, unfortunately. But government policy does encourage paid employee parking by making workplace parking subsidies taxable as a non-wage benefit in kind. The government itself also charges for employee parking at almost all public sector workplaces. In 2018, this was even extended to military bases and to schools, which caused some hot debate. Another unusual thing about workplace parking in Singapore is that it usually includes some paid public parking. There'll be a section that is specifically for season parking, but there's almost always a section for public parking too. So you can park in that paid parking and walk to some nearby destination if you want. Retail outlets and shopping malls that were built since the early 1960s have on-site parking. That's not unusual. But Singapore is unusual in that the parking with retail is almost universally paid parking. Free of charge retail parking is a rarity in Singapore. The price levels for retail parking tend to be close to the prices in other buildings nearby. It's a market phenomenon. Why do shopping centres and workplaces usually have paid parking open to the general public? In most cases, part of the answer is probably that the parking mandates in Singapore are not too excessively high. So pricing makes sense to ration the parking. But perhaps more importantly, this tendency reflects the dense and mixed-use landscapes surrounding most workplaces and most retail buildings in Singapore. Free parking would be a magnet for free riding from people who are working in the area or visiting other buildings in the area. So instead of spending money to enforce against such free riding, it's easier for the building managers to just allow public parking, but to price it. Fortunately, it seems that there were no significant regulatory barriers to this in Singapore, so a tradition of public parking within private buildings emerged. So we've seen a pattern of parking that is open to the public and priced, as we've looked at HDB parking, URA public parking, retail parking and workplace parking. A large proportion of the parking in Singapore is open to the public and priced. In other words, much of the urban landscape consists of park once and walk areas. You can park in any of these buildings and walk to any of the others in the neighbourhood. And we've also seen some reasons for this. Parking mandates usually work against the emergence of park once and walk, but Singapore's parking mandates are moderate enough that paid parking is still possible. And in a dense urban landscape with mixed land uses, we've seen that building managers often decide it's too hard to prevent free riding on their parking. They just manage it using fees instead. Voila! park once and walk districts. Now, one last thing to finish up. Let's look at Singapore's Park and Ride program. The first interesting thing about that is that it was abolished in 2016. Is that a surprise? Singapore is a very transit-oriented metropolitan area. Why did it drop its Park and Ride program that enabled motorists to park near MRT stations at a discounted daily rate? Several reasons were given for getting rid of this scheme. One reason was a low take-up rate, with only 40% of the available parking spaces being used. Another reason was that Park and Ride users were a tiny fraction of the riders on the rail system. Fewer than 0.1% of MRT trips were taken by people using the Park and Ride. And finally, fewer than half of those who did park in the Park and Ride spaces and grabbed the discount ever actually rode the trains. The system was being scammed, so stopping it really was no loss. But the second interesting thing about Singapore's Park and Ride program was that while it lasted from 1993 to 2016, it didn't build any new parking. Instead, it used existing parking areas that had some spare capacity in work hours. Examples included parking at sports facilities and in HDB residential areas that were near MRT stations. Singapore Park and Rides were not purpose-built park and ride lots. So this was a good example of not wasting money to build dedicated park and ride parking facilities. So, if you must have park and ride car parking near rail stations, and you probably should think very carefully before you do that, then at least don't waste money. Use existing parking that is empty enough in work hours, like Singapore did. Well, that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed my little tour of Singapore parking highlights. Bye for now. You've been listening to the Reinventing Parking podcast, and I'm Paul Barter. You can find out more at reinventingparking.org, where you'll find ideas and tips on parking policy. You can also listen to other episodes, subscribe, or leave a comment. That's reinventingparking.org. Bye for now.